It stood like a palace transplanted from another world, its towers glinting under the Manhattan sun, its marble staircase grand enough for kings, and its sheer opulence so excessive that even the rich whispered about it. The Charles M. Schwab Mansion wasn't just a house, it was a statement, an act of defiance against the universe that said, "I will build something so magnificent, even if it destroys me." And in a way, it did. Imagine a home that stretched across an entire city block on Riverside Drive, lavish enough to rival European chateaus, yet doomed from the very beginning by the same forces that built it. You could see it from the river, towering over its neighbors like a castle watching over its subjects. It had turrets, terraces, fountains, even an organ room so large it could have doubled as a small cathedral. But behind the glittering chandeliers and velvet halls, there was something darker, an emptiness that seemed to grow with every passing year. Charles M. Schwab wasn't just another rich man of the Gilded Age. He was a steel titan, a protege of Andrew Carnegie, and at one point, the man many thought would inherit the throne of American industry. He rose from humble beginnings, a boy from Pennsylvania who started as a stake driver and climbed his way up through intelligence, charm, and an almost reckless ambition. But where Carnegie saw frugality as virtue, Schwab saw grandeur as destiny. He wanted to live large, to build, to spend, to be remembered not just for his work, but for the spectacle of his life. In the early 1900s, as the steel empire reached its peak, Schwab decided that New York City needed something extraordinary. Not another Fifth Avenue mansion competing for space among the Astors and Vanderbilts, but something that would stand alone, literally. He found a plot far uptown, on Riverside Drive, overlooking the Hudson River. At that time, it wasn't the fashionable part of Manhattan. People said it was too far, too quiet, too unrefined for the city's elite. But Schwab didn't care. He wasn't following the elite, he wanted them to follow him. He commissioned the architect Maurice Hébert, a man who specialized in French Renaissance designs, and gave him one instruction: no limits. The result was a $6 million masterpiece, completed in 1906, that blended architectural traditions from France's Loire Valley chateaus with modern American innovation. Inside were more than 70 rooms. The grand staircase wound upward like something from a royal court. There was a library paneled in rare woods, ballrooms draped in silk, and a glass conservatory filled with exotic plants. He had a private chapel, a swimming pool, even a garage for his fleet of motor cars, which at the time was a status symbol very few possessed. But there's something fascinating about grandeur. It never exists in isolation. The larger it grows, the more it feeds on the person who creates it. Schwab's mansion wasn't built just out of stone and marble. It was built out of ego, of longing, of an almost tragic refusal to accept limits. And that's where the cracks begin to show, not in the walls, but in the story. You see, while Schwab was building his dream palace, he was also building his downfall. His relationship with Carnegie had soured. His decisions as head of Bethlehem Steel were bold, even visionary at times, but reckless in others. He gambled, he entertained lavishly, and he spent money like the world would never run out of it. The Schwab Mansion became a stage for that extravagance. Dinners with hundreds of guests, orchestras playing late into the night, champagne flowing as if prohibition would never come. But the truth about houses like these is that they often outlive their owners' fortunes. By the 1920s, America had changed. The Gilded Age was over, and Schwab's kind of excess no longer inspired admiration. It invited pity. The stock market crash of 1929 hit him like a hammer. Bethlehem Steel survived, but Schwab's personal finances didn't. The mansion, which once symbolized his triumph, became an anchor dragging him down. There's an eerie image that often comes up when people describe those years. Picture this massive, glittering mansion on Riverside Drive, once alive with servants, guests, and laughter, now dark, quiet, and echoing. Schwab, who had once been one of the richest men in the country, was nearly broke, wandering those vast hallways alone. The house that was meant to showcase his success had become a monument to his decline. But even that isn't the strangest part. What happened to the mansion after Schwab is the part most people don't know, and it's almost poetic in its irony. After his death in 1939, no one wanted the mansion, not because it wasn't beautiful, it was, but because it was too much, too large to maintain, too costly to heat, too extravagant for a post-Depression America. The city tried to find a use for it. There was talk of turning it into the mayor's residence, a museum, even a university building. None of it happened. The neighborhood around Riverside Drive had shifted. New York was changing. The people moving in were of a different class, and the idea of living in a 75-room mansion seemed absurd, almost grotesque. So it stood there, decaying slowly, its grandeur fading under layers of dust and neglect. The marble floors cracked, the gardens overgrew, and the chandeliers that once sparkled with light began to rust and dim. Neighbors passed by without a glance. Children whispered rumors about ghosts in its halls, and those who remembered its glory shook their heads at what it had become. Eventually, in 1947, the inevitable happened. The Schwab Mansion, once one of the most magnificent homes in all of New York, was demolished. Not sold, not restored, not preserved. Torn down, erased. In its place, they built a set of plain red brick apartment buildings known as the Schwab House, a name that feels almost cruelly ironic. The mansion that had once symbolized one man's dream of immortality was gone, and with it, a piece of New York's forgotten past. But if you look closely, if you walk by Riverside Drive and stand near 73rd Street, you might still feel it, the faint outline of that ambition, that hubris, that ghost of a time when men thought they could buy eternity with marble and gold. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the loss of a building. It's the way it mirrors the man who built it. Charles Schwab's life was a cycle of dazzling success followed by inevitable collapse, of brilliance overshadowed by his inability to stop himself from wanting more. The mansion was him, translated into stone. When it fell, so did he. But that's not the full story, not yet, because behind all that wealth and ruin lies something deeper, a story about class, power, and the strange psychology of wanting to be seen. Schwab didn't just want comfort, he wanted validation. He wanted to stand out in a city full of titans, to have something that said, "I matter more than the rest." And when that craving becomes your identity, it doesn't end when the money runs out. It keeps haunting you, even when the lights go dark. What's even more intriguing is how this mansion's ghost still lingers in the DNA of the city. It's a warning and a temptation. Because every generation has its Charles Schwabs, men and women who rise, build, shine, and fall. The skyline changes, the materials evolve, but the hunger stays the same. And maybe that's the real legacy of the Schwab Mansion. Not the marble halls or the vanished gardens, but the idea that New York itself, this city of ambition and illusion, never stops producing new castles and new dreamers, each convinced they'll be the one to outlast time. Yet time always wins. And when you look back at photographs of that mansion, standing proud against the horizon, you can almost hear it whispering a truth that's both tragic and timeless. That grandeur without balance eventually becomes its own undoing. Because in the end, what's left isn't the house, it's the story. There's something almost cinematic about imagining that mansion now, the way it would have felt to step inside when it was alive. The first thing you'd notice wasn't the opulence, but the silence before the music started. Servants in crisp uniforms moving like clockwork, the scent of cigar smoke mixed with perfume, the echo of laughter from a corridor that seemed to stretch forever. It wasn't just a home, it was theater. Every dinner, every gathering, was another act in the performance of Charles Schwab's success. And make no mistake, he loved the performance. Schwab was charismatic in a way that drew people to him. He had a boyish confidence, a charm that made even rivals lower their guard. Carnegie once said he was the best salesman he'd ever met. But behind that easy grin was a man always chasing approval, always needing to be seen as the biggest, the brightest, the boldest in the room. And in that chase, he mistook attention for affection. During those lavish evenings in his mansion, you could find senators, bankers, artists, even European nobility seated at his table. They came not for him, but for the spectacle, the rare wines, the imported orchids, the view from the terrace that made you feel like the city belonged to you. Schwab fed off that energy. He wanted to impress them all. But when the guests left and the lights dimmed, the echo of his own footsteps was said to fill the halls. That's the thing about grandeur. It's intoxicating when it's full and unbearable when it's empty. The servants who worked there used to say the house changed with him. When he was in good spirits, it was full of life, laughter spilling from room to room. But when his fortunes started to falter, the atmosphere shifted. He would wander at night, walking from one end of the mansion to the other, as if searching for something he'd lost but couldn't name. There's a certain loneliness that wealth can't hide. You can almost imagine him, standing by one of those massive windows overlooking the Hudson River, staring out at the city he thought he'd conquered. The lights across the water reflected back like ghosts of all his ambitions. The mansion, for all its beauty, had become a mirror, and what it showed him wasn't victory. It was vulnerability. And yet there's another layer to this story that most people miss. Schwab's mansion wasn't just a monument to excess, it was also a monument to innovation. He filled it with technology that was decades ahead of its time. Electric lighting in every room, elevators, telephones, central heating, and a ventilation system that kept the air fresh in the ballroom even during summer galas. It was an engineering marvel disguised as a home. That duality between brilliance and overreach was Schwab himself. He was the kind of man who could see the future before others, but he couldn't quite live within it. His greatest ideas came with equal parts genius and danger. He revolutionized steel production by pushing efficiency beyond what anyone thought possible, yet his business deals often flirted with disaster. He had the mind of an engineer, but the soul of a gambler. And like any gambler, he believed his luck would last forever. But luck, especially in New York, has a way of running out. The world that had once adored men like Schwab began to shift. The Great Depression didn't just wipe out fortunes, it changed what people valued. Opulence began to look obscene. Extravagance became guilt. The very traits that once made Schwab admired now made him a symbol of excess gone wrong. Imagine the irony of it all. The man who helped build the steel backbone of America, whose innovations made the skyscrapers possible, lost the very symbol of his own empire, a mansion made of stone, steel, and pride. It's almost poetic in a tragic kind of way. And yet Schwab himself refused to let go of appearances. Even as his finances crumbled, he kept up the facade. He continued entertaining, continued dressing sharply, continued talking about new ventures that would turn it all around. There's something hauntingly human about that. The refusal to admit defeat, the need to believe you're still in control, even when the walls are closing in. In his later years, Schwab's life took on a ghostly rhythm. He spent more and more time away from New York, retreating to smaller residences or traveling abroad, while his mansion, his great masterpiece, sat waiting for him like a loyal but decaying friend. There were fewer parties now, fewer guests, but the house was still kept ready, as if expecting its master to walk through the door in triumph again. By the time of his death, Schwab was a shadow of the man he'd once been. He died in relative obscurity, far from the glittering lights that had once adored him. The newspapers that once celebrated his every move now mentioned him in brief columns, more as a footnote than a headline. The mansion, meanwhile, loomed over the city like a relic from another era, too large, too magnificent, too out of step with the times to survive. When the wrecking crews came in 1947, there were protests from a few historians and preservationists, but not enough to save it. To most New Yorkers, it was just another symbol of the old world being swept away. What replaced it, those red brick apartments, were functional, unremarkable, practical. Everything the Schwab Mansion wasn't. And yet, if you talk to some of the residents of the Schwab house today, they'll tell you strange things. Stories about cold drafts in hallways where there shouldn't be any. The faint sound of piano music late at night. A shadowy figure seen near the elevators, dressed in what looks like an old-fashioned tuxedo. Maybe it's all superstition. Or maybe, just maybe, some places remember their past more vividly than we do. Because here's the thing. Buildings, like people, have energy. They absorb the emotions of those who lived within them. The Schwab Mansion wasn't just marble and wood. It was built on obsession, pride, and yearning. And when something that powerful disappears, it doesn't vanish quietly. It leaves an imprint. Sometimes I think about what Schwab might say if he could see that block now. Would he laugh at the irony? Or would he mourn the loss of his dream? Maybe he'd understand that in a city like New York, nothing lasts forever. Not wealth, not glory, not even marble castles. But maybe he'd also feel a flicker of pride, knowing that people still remember him, not as a hero, but as a lesson. The story of the Charles M. Schwab Mansion isn't really about a house. It's about what happens when ambition outgrows reason, when success turns into spectacle, and when the pursuit of greatness blinds us to the quiet things that make life meaningful. It's about how even the grandest dreams can crumble, not because they were small, but because they were too big for the world to hold. And if you think about it, that's what makes New York so endlessly fascinating. It's a city built on impossible dreams, on people like Schwab who dared to imagine too much. Every skyscraper that pierces the clouds today carries a bit of that same spirit, the belief that you can rise higher, that you can defy limits. But every rise has a fall, and every castle, no matter how luxurious, eventually turns to dust. Still, if you stand by the river at dusk, where the mansion once stood, and watch the sunlight fade over the Hudson, you might catch a glimpse, not of the house itself, but of the dream that built it, a dream too bright, too fragile, and too human to ever fully disappear. It's strange to think that a house so magnificent could disappear so completely as though it had never existed. But that's how New York works. It devours its past, one block at a time. The Schwab Mansion wasn't the first grand home to vanish, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. Yet its disappearance hit differently. It wasn't just another mansion, it was a monument to an era, to a mindset, to the illusion that wealth could somehow rewrite time itself. If you walk along Riverside Drive today, you won't see a trace of it. No gate, no foundation, no stone carved with the Schwab name. Just the steady hum of traffic, the rustle of trees, and apartment windows stacked one above another, practical and identical. But if you stop long enough, if you close your eyes, you can almost imagine it rising again from memory. You can picture the wide marble steps, the copper-roofed turrets, the massive arched windows catching the morning light, the kind of place that didn't just sit on the landscape, it commanded it. The mansion's story might have ended with demolition, but its meaning didn't. In a way, it's become a parable of the city itself. Every generation that comes to New York brings its own version of the Schwab dream. Build something so big, so brilliant, that the world can't ignore you. And yet, the city always wins. The skyline changes, the names on the doors fade, and the only thing that remains is the cycle: ambition, creation, decline, and erasure. But let's go back to the man behind it for a moment, because Schwab's story still lingers in the details most people skip. For instance, he wasn't heartless or cruel. In fact, many who knew him described him as generous, even kind. He treated workers better than most industrialists of his time. He gave to charities, funded churches, even paid for employees' children to go to school. That makes his downfall even more tragic, because it wasn't caused by malice or corruption. It was caused by an inability to stop believing that success was a permanent state of being. When the world shifted under his feet, he didn't know how to live without the applause. That's something you see over and over in the lives of people who build empires, not just financial ones, but emotional ones too. When the admiration fades, they crumble. The Schwab Mansion was built out of that need to be admired, to be seen, to stand out among men who had already built their own legends. In a city that worshipped success, Schwab didn't want to be just another steel baron. He wanted to be the most unforgettable one. And for a while, he was. The newspapers couldn't get enough of him. The house was described as a marvel of modern comfort and old-world beauty. Guests would tell stories for years after visiting, how they'd gotten lost in its endless corridors, or how the chandeliers seemed to glow like sunlight trapped in crystal. Every inch of it was designed to inspire awe. But behind every carefully arranged tableau of luxury, there was also fear. Fear of fading into obscurity. Fear that one day someone else would build something grander, newer, better. That's the hidden cost of always trying to outshine everyone else. The light blinds you. By the time the Depression hit, the mansion had already become something of an anomaly. The world was moving toward efficiency, minimalism, a kind of sleek modernism that left no room for 75-room chateaus. Schwab's house wasn't just out of step with the times, it was a fossil of a vanished idea of wealth. And just as the building began to decay, so did the myth of limitless prosperity it represented. You could argue that its destruction was inevitable. New York was growing too fast to keep such monuments intact. Land was too valuable, taste too fickle. The same drive that had made Schwab build it, the urge to always create something new, was the same drive that would erase it. The city that rewards ambition also consumes it. Still, there's something unsettling about how quickly it all vanished. The demolition took only a few weeks. Reporters came by to photograph the process, capturing the moment the grand staircase was reduced to rubble, the ballroom to dust. One journalist wrote that watching it fall felt like watching an age die quietly. No crowds, no protests, just the slow, methodical dismantling of a dream. But here's the haunting part. After the dust settled, the memory of the mansion refused to die. It kept reappearing in articles, in books about lost New York, in the stories of old residents who remembered its silhouette against the river. It became a symbol not of what was, but of what was lost, an emblem of how beauty and pride can coexist with fragility. There's a kind of strange comfort in that, because even though the mansion no longer stands, its story still does. And stories, unlike buildings, don't need foundations. They just need someone to remember. Maybe that's why the tale of the Schwab Mansion keeps resurfacing, generation after generation. It taps into something universal, the dream of permanence in a world that refuses to stay still. It's the same instinct that drives artists to paint, writers to write, entrepreneurs to build. We all want to leave something behind that says, I was here, I mattered. Schwab just took that impulse to its grandest extreme. And yet what remains of him now isn't the marble or the chandeliers, it's the lesson. The quiet reminder that even the grandest dreams must live within the limits of time and change, that what we build to immortalize ourselves can just as easily become our undoing. If you think about it, the Schwab Mansion wasn't a failure at all. It achieved exactly what its owner wanted. It made him unforgettable. More than a century later, we're still talking about him, still captivated by the ruins of his ambition. The mansion might be gone, but the story lives on like an echo, fading yet constant, drifting through the city he once tried to conquer. So maybe that's the final twist. Charles Schwab didn't lose everything. He just built something too big for one lifetime to hold. Something that slipped from the physical world into legend, where it could never be demolished again. And somewhere, maybe, the ghost of that mansion still stands, silent, magnificent, and eternal, reminding us that greatness isn't always measured in what survives, but in what refuses to be forgotten. New York has always had a strange relationship with memory. It's a city built on forgetting, on tearing down and rebuilding, on burying the past beneath another layer of ambition. But somehow the Schwab Mansion refuses to disappear completely. It exists now in photographs, in faint architectural drawings, in fragments of gossip preserved in old newspapers, and in the imagination of anyone who's ever been haunted by the beauty of something that no longer exists. When you look at those old black and white photos, the first thing that strikes you is the audacity of it, the scale, the detail, the absolute defiance of restraint. The mansion looked like it had been teleported from the French countryside and planted on a cliff overlooking the Hudson. You can see why people thought it was excessive, and yet you can also see why Schwab fell in love with it. It was proof, tangible, glittering proof that he had arrived. But what no photograph can capture is what it felt like to be inside it. Imagine walking through those halls late at night when the parties were over, the laughter faded, and all that remained was the hum of silence. You'd hear the faint ticking of clocks, the whisper of the river outside, the creak of the wooden floor beneath your feet. A house that grand must have felt alive, in the same way that empty theaters feel alive after the audience leaves. The walls hold on to echoes, even when no one's listening. Some people say that every great house tells you something about its builder, not in words, but in the way the space moves. The Schwab Mansion was expansive but oddly cold. Beautiful, yes, but not warm. There were too many rooms, too much distance between everything. You could walk for minutes and not hear another human voice. That says something, doesn't it? About a man who wanted to be surrounded by the world but couldn't quite fill it. And that's where the story gets even more human. Because beneath all the talk of money and marble and excess, what you find is loneliness. Not the kind that comes from isolation, but the kind that comes from chasing something that never stops moving. Schwab's entire life was a pursuit of success, of admiration, of immortality. The mansion was just the physical form of that chase, and once it was built, there was nowhere left to go. It's almost like he built his own museum before his life was even over. Every painting, every piece of furniture, every imported chandelier, each one a testament to a man desperate to leave a mark. But the thing about museums is that they're for the dead, not the living. After Schwab's death, the mansion stood empty for years. Its caretakers tried to keep it up, but the upkeep was astronomical. Roofs leaked, pipes burst, paint peeled, dust settled where champagne once spilled. Eventually, vandals found their way in. Teenagers broke windows, stray cats moved into the basement, and rainwater pooled in the ballroom. The house that once hosted the elite became a hollow carcass of what it used to be. There's something profoundly sad about that image, a place once alive with power, reduced to silence and decay. But it's also poetic, in a way that only New York can make tragedy poetic. Because this city doesn't let anything rot in peace. It turns everything into a story, a rumor, a lesson. And in that transformation, it gives even loss a strange kind of immortality. Think about how often New York does this. The original Penn Station, gone. The Waldorf Astoria's old ballroom, gone. The grand theaters of Broadway that once hosted kings of the stage, gone. Each replaced by something newer, shinier, but emptier. And yet people still talk about them, still mourn them, still imagine what it must have been like to walk through their doors. Maybe that's the price of progress. The past doesn't vanish. It just becomes ghostly. The Schwab Mansion, in that sense, is a ghost story disguised as history. It's the spirit of a time when ambition meant building higher, bigger, louder. A time when beauty and arrogance walked hand in hand. And every time someone stumbles upon an old photo of it, they feel that ghost brush against them, whispering something about what it means to dream too big. It's easy to judge Schwab from a distance, to say he was greedy, reckless, foolish for building something so impractical. But if we're honest, most of us have a little of that same hunger. We want to create something lasting, something that says we were here. We might not build mansions, but we build reputations, brands, legacies. We chase likes, fame, success, whatever immortality looks like in our own time. And maybe one day people will look back at our digital skyscrapers and think they built too much, too fast, and forgot to live in what they built. That's why the Schwab Mansion still matters. It's not about nostalgia, it's about reflection. It forces you to ask uncomfortable questions about what success actually means. What's the point of having everything if you can't stop long enough to enjoy it? What good is power if it isolates you? How much is enough before you become trapped by the very thing you created? Because in the end, that's what happened to Charles Schwab. The man who had everything ended up with nothing. The man who built the most magnificent house in New York died almost penniless. And yet, even in ruin, he achieved something few ever do. He became a story worth telling. Maybe that's the truest form of legacy, not the buildings we leave behind, but the emotions we stir long after we're gone. The Schwab Mansion may have been demolished, but its ghost still lingers, whispering through time, reminding us that ambition is both our greatest gift and our greatest curse. And maybe, just maybe, that's what Schwab himself understood too late, that you can build a house that touches the skies high, but if it doesn't have a soul, it'll crumble long before the walls do. The more you study Charles Schwab's life, the more it starts to feel like a fable written by the city itself, one about brilliance, excess, and the quiet inevitability of decline. Because Schwab wasn't just any man who fell from grace, he was someone who embodied the very spirit of American ambition at its most intoxicating peak. He didn't inherit his wealth, he built it, earned it, shaped it with his own hands and mind. That's what made his downfall sting even more. It wasn't stolen by others, it was consumed by his own fire. He was born in 1862 in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, a world away from marble staircases and gala dinners. His parents were hard-working, modest people, and from an early age Schwab had this restless spark, that drive to do more, be more. When he joined Carnegie Steelworks, he wasn't content to just do his job. He studied everything, production methods, cost margins, how men worked and how they thought. Carnegie noticed. By his mid-30s, Schwab was president of Carnegie Steel, the youngest man ever to hold the position. He was a genius at motivating others. He used praise where others used punishment, charm where others used authority. But beneath the charm was calculation. Schwab knew how to make people feel important, and that made them loyal. It was this gift that helped him negotiate one of the biggest business deals in American history, the sale of Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan, which became U.S. Steel. The deal made Schwab immensely rich. He could have stopped there. He could have lived quietly as a titan of industry. But that wasn't who he was. Schwab wanted his own empire, not just to serve another man's dream. So he founded Bethlehem Steel, and for a time it was his redemption. Under his leadership, Bethlehem became one of the most powerful companies in America. He revolutionized how steel was made, introduced new technologies, and helped build the country's infrastructure, bridges, railways, skyscrapers. His name carried weight. His influence was everywhere. But as the company rose, so did his ego. The fortune he earned didn't fill him, it fueled him. He began to live like a man who thought the universe had bent to his will. Lavish parties, racing yachts, gambling trips in Monte Carlo, champagne that never stopped flowing. His name became a symbol of indulgence, a whisper that echoed through the elite circles of New York and Paris alike. And with each year, he needed a little more of that whisper to feel alive. The mansion on Riverside Drive was just the physical extension of that hunger. He wanted something no one else had. Not another Fifth Avenue townhouse lost in a crowd of marble facades, but a castle that stood alone, majestic and untouchable. And that's exactly what he got. But in that act of separating himself from everyone else, he also separated himself from reality. Even during its prime, some visitors noticed something odd about the mansion. It was beautiful, yes, but it felt lonely. Too grand for comfort, too quiet for joy. Servants said it always felt like it was waiting for something. A party, a guest, an event that never quite lived up to the space. The larger the house grew, the smaller the man inside it seemed to become. There's a strange thing that happens when you get everything you've ever wanted. The climb defines you so much that once you reach the top, you realize there's nowhere left to go. Schwab, in many ways, was addicted to the climb. Success wasn't his goal, it was his drug. And like any addiction, it required bigger and riskier doses to satisfy. He started gambling not just at casinos, but in business. Risky deals, unwise expansions, extravagant spending that ignored economic tides. When the Great Depression hit, the world that had once admired his boldness suddenly saw recklessness. Banks withdrew support. Investments collapsed. His empire began to wobble, then crumble. But the hardest part wasn't losing the money. It was losing the illusion. The invitations stopped coming. The same people who'd toasted him in gold-lit ballrooms now whispered about him over cocktails, calling him a relic of the Gilded Age. In that silence, his mansion, his greatest pride, became unbearable. It was too big for one man, too loud a reminder of what used to be. By the time Schwab died in 1939, most of his fortune was gone. He was living quietly, almost modestly, far from the grand halls that once echoed with orchestras, and the city around him had changed. The Manhattan he'd tried to immortalize in stone had moved on. New buildings had risen, new names had replaced his. The mansion stood empty, like a ghost stranded in a new century that no longer believed in castles. When they tore it down 8 years later, there were no grand speeches, no ceremonies. The wrecking crew treated it like any other demolition job. But imagine what that must have felt like for those who remembered what it once was. To see a palace that had once represented the pinnacle of American ambition reduced to rubble, piece by piece, under the indifferent swing of a crane. Maybe that's why the story still stings. Because deep down, it reminds us of something we don't like to admit, that all of this, everything we build, everything we chase, is temporary. That no matter how high we rise, the world moves on without us. And yet, the Schwab Mansion wasn't a waste. Its beauty, its excess, its downfall, they've outlived the very bricks it was made from. Its story still reaches people who never saw it, never knew its owner, but understand its message instinctively. That ambition is both the fire that builds and the fire that burns. If you walk along Riverside Drive today, where the Schwab House apartments now stand, you'd never guess that a marble palace once dominated that skyline. But the air feels heavier there, somehow, as if it remembers. The Hudson still runs below, reflecting the same sunset Schwab used to watch from his terrace. The city still hums, restless, ambitious, hungry. And maybe that's the truest legacy of Charles Schwab, not the mansion itself, but the idea behind it. The refusal to be ordinary. The willingness to dream dangerously big, even if it costs everything. Because while his house may be gone, that part of him lives on in every person who looks at New York's skyline and thinks, I could build something that lasts forever. And maybe, for a moment, they're right. But the city will always whisper back, forever doesn't live here.